Right, this video is on the displacement of metals. This will be found in topic 4, which is chemical change, and is a fairly common type of reaction which is based upon the reactivity of metals. We can use this to, first of all, establish a reactivity series, and secondly then we can use that established reactivity series to make predictions about reactions of other metals. Now, there is obviously no point in reacting copper with copper sulfate, iron with iron sulfate, zinc with zinc sulfate, and magnesium with magnesium sulfate, because there will be no reaction. So hence I put a line through each of them. Also, you will notice that I'm using copper sulfate, iron sulfate, zinc sulfate, and magnesium sulfate. So any reaction that occurs can only be due to the metal, not the anion. So this is our setup. So in this first one, I'm going to have 3 lots of copper sulfate solution, and I'll then fill the others up with iron sulfate, 3 test tubes of that, then zinc sulfate, and then magnesium sulfate. So I'll just do that now. Now, these are our other solutions. This is iron 2 sulfate, this is zinc sulfate, and this is magnesium sulfate. Now, if I go back to copper sulfate, I'm going to add to 1 test tube iron, and we'll look for a reaction. To the next one, I'm going to add a piece of zinc. To the next one, I'm going to add a piece of magnesium, like so. Then, if I move on to the iron sulfate, to that, I'm first of all going to add a piece of copper. To the next one, I'm going to add a piece of zinc. To the last one, I'm going to add a piece of magnesium. Now, moving along further to our zinc sulfate. So the first one, piece of copper. Next one, piece of iron. And then to the last one, piece of magnesium. And finally, to the magnesium sulfate. So, magnesium sulfate, piece of copper, piece of iron, and a piece of zinc. Now, we will leave these to react, and then we will look for signs of reaction occurring. Now, let's look for signs of reactions. If we look at this, I'm going to pour the copper sulfate solution off, and let's have a look at what we see about the nail. Now the nail, as you can see, it's got a reddy brown coating on it. This is because copper is formed on the surface. So iron has displaced the copper. So in terms of this then, I'm just going to work on ticks and things here. I'm going to put a tick in here so reaction occurs. Now, let's look at the zinc. If we look at the zinc, you can see there's reddy brown there and copper is displaced there, and also you'll notice that solution is slightly lighter than when we did the reaction before, when we started. And likewise, if we look at the magnesium, we've got on the bottom of the test tube, we've got a reddy brown deposit of copper. So a reaction has occurred there. Now in each of the cases here, as we can see, copper has been displaced by the metals that we are using. Let's move along to the iron. Now if we look at the iron, there's no change at all to the copper. So nothing happens. We look at the zinc. There's a bit of bubbling, slightly grayer because we've got some iron, so there's a reaction occurring there. And if we look at the magnesium, as you can see, it's fizzing away, showing there's a reaction occurring, and also we've got a deposit on the bottom, and the piece of magnesium is actually getting darker, so there's a reaction occurring there. Moving along to our solutions of zinc sulfate. As you can see, the copper is absolutely no change, so there's no reaction. We look at the iron, there's no change in the nail, so there's no reaction there. We look at the magnesium. Now if you look at the magnesium, there's some fizzing, and also on the base here we've got tiny bits of zinc being deposited, so there's a reaction occurring there. Now if we look at our magnesium sulfate solution, copper, absolutely no change. Iron, no change there. And zinc, absolutely no change there. Now this is our set of results. We can see that magnesium is by far the most reactive because the reactions occur in all three solutions. With the zinc, the reactions in 2 of them, and iron there's 1, and copper there's none. So the order of reactivity must be magnesium is greater than zinc, which is greater than iron, and is greater than copper. Now the reason why copper doesn't, and no reaction with copper, is because it is less reactive than any of the other 3 metals. Now let's look what happens in the reactions by looking at the word equations. So here we've got copper sulfate and magnesium. Now basically what happens is that the magnesium takes the place of the copper, so we get magnesium sulfate and copper. Hence our observations: a ready bound coating of copper metal, and also the solution gets paler because magnesium sulfate solution is colourless. Similarly with copper sulfate and zinc, we get zinc sulfate and copper. Hence we saw a ready bound deposit of copper, and also the solution gets slightly lighter because zinc sulfate is colourless. And finally iron sulfate plus copper is formed there in the same way. Now this one won't tend to go colourless, it will tend to go a sludgy green colour because iron sulfate is that sort of colour. Now in follow-up work we'll apply this to other chemical reactions. We'll also use it to write balanced chemical equations, so practicing writing equations, and also making predictions.